Good morning, good evening, and good night to my fellow gentle modern primates. My name is Erica, also known as Gutsick Gibbon here on YouTube, and we are back with another absolutely thrilling episode of covering Genesis Apologetics as they do dumb nonsense and post it online for all to see. So today we're looking at the second of their myths, which I actually forget what it is. Again, I have not watched this in advance, so I figured, as usual, we can do this together. So as I typically suggest, I would find a comfortable location and get a nice drink, something warm. I would typically suggest, since it is still technically winter, I guess, sort of. Yeah. It's March, that counts. As we sit back together and sort of take this second myth apart. You'll notice that I am in rather comfortable clothes today. I'm of course wearing my pajamas underneath this sort of get up here. I've got my fine swine pants. They've got like fancy pigs on them. I'm nursing this pimple on my chin, so I'm just feeling all dolled up. I got all special for you guys. Anyways, I thought we could just jump right into it. Today's a casual kind of day. So let's begin. Let's let Genesis Apologetics Oh wait, actually, I forgot. We like to start these things off with some actual good information, some fascinating facts from anthropology. And it just so happens I saw something quite interesting today on Reddit, which I know is, the pinnacle of excellent source-based knowledge. So we gotta check. Today I learned, excellent, and it should be up at the top. Here it is. So today I learned that prehistoric hunter-gatherer tribes had an average group limit of 50 people. Incidentally, modern research shows that in video games such as World of Warcraft, the maximum group player cohesiveness occurs at a limit of 50 players. Now typically, at least when we're looking at group living animals that would of course include humans, group living does indeed max out at around, I think the range is 100 to 150, but again, they're talking about general cohesiveness. So this seems pretty on the level. But we're gonna check it out anyways and just see. We'll maybe look at the comments too. Ooh, Dunbar's number, Robin Dunbar. Did you guys know Robin Dunbar is? Ooh, I don't know. I have a secondary relationship with Robin Dunbar, the propagator of the social brain hypothesis, which suggests that primates have larger brains than other mammals in order to maintain large group sizes. So, Dunbar's number. That's actually I'm not sure that 50 is literally Dunbar's number. Let's check it out. Dunbar's number. All right, Google knows they're going to get my data. I don't know. Even if I didn't consent to this, they would still take it. Okay. Hold on here. I agree. You can have it. Take all my data. Send me targeted ads. The cognitive limit to the number of people with whom we can... Yeah, so here's what I was talking about here. So kin being around 5. Oops. There we go. So kin being around 5, superfamily being 15, clan is 50, and of course a tribe goes up to 150. So, look at this. Just proving yet again that occasionally I do know what I'm talking about. Anyways, let's go ahead and begin. But I thought that was a nice fact. It's not quite as cute as last time when we were talking about sort of dog monuments and epithets. Damn it. What have I told you guys about watching me spell? Epithets. 2 dogs by the Romans, and of course not listed were the Egyptians. But how about we get to the meat of it, since I've wasted enough of your time already. Let's begin. Shilling, shameless shilling. We always start off with that, which is nice. Creation clips obtained from the creation... Okay.
Myth number 2 is the Bible's account of creation is only metaphorical. The 6 creation days are not ordinary days, and creation really unfolded over millions of years.
So, isn't that technically like 3 myths instead of just one? The account is metaphorical, that it took place over millions of years. That would be the second one, and that they're not literal days. So those are kind of like 3 separate things that don't necessarily have to relate to one another. In fact, I would argue that saying that it's metaphorical and saying that the intent is that they're not real days, they sort of actually clash with one another. But they could also inhabit the same reality. I mean, let's say it's a metaphor, but in reality, of course, we're dealing with sort of the day-age hypothesis of theology, which is that we are dealing with enormous periods of time, and then, of course, that they are millions of years. So I guess that works, but I think, I don't know, those could also technically be 3 different things, so we got to be clear with our terms here. Dan Biddle? Is it Dan Biddle? I'm pretty sure it is. Dapper Dinosaur told me about this the other day, but let's check. Dan Biddle, Genesis, Apologetics. I really like this thing where you guys can see. Yeah, okay. Daniel Biddle, the president of Genesis Apologetics, which equips students with biblical answers to evolutionary teaching in public schools. You can't out-riddle the Biddle is something that you could say, but I wouldn't recommend it because I just said it out loud and it doesn't sound great. Sorry for the cut, dudes. Had a tea break. Had to get some more. This kind of thing takes a lot out of me, and the tea is the fuel. Sorry for the flashing too. My sort of webcam is it belongs in the trash, and one of these days I'm going to start a Patreon, so that I can be showered in material wealth, as many YouTubers of my size are. Anyway, sorry if you hear any shouting in the background. The love of my life is enjoying World of Warcraft or League of Legends. I'm not sure which one it actually is today in the other room, and you know how things get heated with dork stuff, similar to how they do here, which I would also consider this dork stuff, but both in good ways. So let's get back to this debunking the 7 myths. Let's let old Dan Biddle finish. I'm sorry I got us off track with my tea.
People's creation account is not so vague that it's subject to each person's
vague, maybe,
unique spin. The Bible clearly narrates how God created everything over a 6-day period. What else could God have meant when he wrote with his own hands, and in the 10 Commandments no less, that he created in 6 days, and even wanted us to model our lives after the same weekly cycle?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's especially the modeling the same day with the weekly cycle. I mean, yes and no, right? It hasn't always been a 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. Particularly, obviously, not universally within all cultures, but even in the Western world, the work week has kind of shifted around quite some time. I mean, typically we don't work on Saturdays or Sundays. That's somewhat beside the point, but I guess just worth mentioning. More importantly, there's sort of this theme in the Bible, right, where numbers repeat if they bear repeating, if they're thematically important. The number 3 obviously is quite vital. I believe 40 is another one. But you also see this repetition of 6 and 1. And it's not always in days. I'm pretty sure it's in Exodus somewhere where we see 6 years, 1 year, right? 6 years of famine, 1 year of not famine. I'm not 100% sure, all right? I'm not a theologian. But I'm just pointing out that this isn't necessarily a one-to-one, that every time we see 6 and 1, it's in reference to the 6 original days, which kind of gives credence to the Christians out there who are into like the day-age theory. But you know, that's just me.
It wouldn't make sense if this part of the 10 Commandments was figurative, couched in between literal commandments like don't steal, don't lie, and don't commit adultery.
It cannot be 6, that was kind of my point. It cannot be 6 literal days and then a single literal day, and still, like, in actuality, assuming the creation story is literally something that occurred, be it allegorical, be it metaphoric, or not metaphorical, sort of hyperbolic, or if we're even allowing the 6,000-year-old creation to be kind of into the mix. It doesn't have to be literal to be included with the rest of the commandments. I mean, I don't think that remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy rests on the fact that the Sabbath was a single day, because again, we see this theme of 6 and 1 repeat, and it's not always in days. Also, thou shalt not have no other gods before me. That's interesting. We'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about the sons of God. I'm not sure if that's going to be in this episode or in a later one, but I do like these CG tablets. These are quite nice. They, I mean, considering the budget, they look like something that Genesis Apologetics had made themselves, which I can appreciate.
Did Jesus or any of the New Testament writers update what God said? Certainly not. He wanted us to believe, back then and still today, that he created in 6 days.
That's awfully presumptuous, Genesis Apologetics. Hey, just so you know, when God said this, what he meant was this. When he wrote in original Hebrew, when he inspired humans to write in original Hebrew, what he meant was this paradigm that we're pushing in modern English after numerous linguistic translations and, of course, numerous cultural translations. Thank you, Genesis Apologetics, for clearing that up for us. We really did need your guidance. Also, is this a triple quote? Are you guys seeing this? Look, 3 quotes here to end, 2 quotes here at the beginning. I know I'm nitpicking, but I get kind of mean when I'm dealing with guys like Genesis Apologetics. They make me angry. And not because, as some creationists might posit, they're getting under my skin with all their truth. They make me angry because of their incompetence, which tends to be one of my pet peeves. We'll let them continue.
Looking at the actual text, the writer was directed by the Holy Spirit to use certain Hebrew words and phrases to describe creation.
I can't wait to hear them justify this. Let's talk about these Hebrew words. I love that. I'm not an expert, again, because I've been duped into believing that I duped myself into believing, because I didn't watch it ahead of time, that this was going to be more of a science thing, and I'm hoping, again, that we're heading along that trajectory, but I've at least got cursory knowledge of the hermeneutics, I believe is how you pronounce it. But again, at least we've got this repeat shot of Moses's. I mean, his cuticles are kind of a mess, but we're looking at some pretty healthy nails for a guy living, in sort of the early agricultural era. But he could maybe clean underneath the fingernails a little bit.
And it sure seems like they went out of their way to define the creation timeline. For example, day, or Yom in Hebrew, is defined in verses 14 to 16 when God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night.
I hope that they're going to go over this, and they probably will, but I'm going to be the first to point it out just because I feel that it's a typical sort of busting creationist gotcha moment. Obviously, the moon is not a light. It reflects the light of the sun. So this is already quite strange. I mean, and this is a great example of something that we're going to see a lot of, and that I'm going to point out quite frequently, which is that God, we're going to work under the assumption that God is a legitimate entity in this sort of narrative that I'm going to lay out for you, at least in this episode. But that regardless of whether God was involved in abiogenesis or the like, the Earth is indeed very ancient, and of course evolutionary theory is legitimate, and that a proper exegesis, which of course, for those of you who don't know, because I didn't know until I looked it up, an exegesis is sort of it's an interpretation. It's an eisegesis would be using external sources to kind of influence how you interpret a text, and an exegesis would be interpreting the text within its own context, so to speak. So an exegesis is what you want to do. You want to have a good exegesis, and I've heard many good arguments when I was a very firm theistic evolutionist, which I'm less so now, just because I'm in a period of searching for myself, not on the evolution part, more on the theistic part. But I'm just doing a searching period, as some of you probably know well. But I investigated this quite deeply at that time period, and there's some excellent evidence that we're going to go through today on why a proper exegesis, even in and of itself, seems to preclude a 6 literal day creation, at least in my opinion and in the opinion of several academics. But again, what my point was, the whole reason I paused this, other than to make this moon jab, was to go ahead and bring up the fact that Hebrew words translate kind of weird. All right, and that a lot of that has to do with culture. So an excellent example is when we see in a modern biblical text references to the heart or the mind. The original Hebrew word for that is entrails, or references to the kidney and the liver, because those people groups, and many indeed around them, particularly the Egyptians, that's why they they threw the brain out and they put like liver and kidneys and pancreas and things like that into canopic jars, because those were additionally where they thought that the sort of the soul and the mind dwelled. Similar with the Hebrews. I mean, we can look this up for ourselves. Let's do it. What do you say? Let's just make this leap together. Hebrew word for entrails and mind. Let's see what we got here. What do we got? Topical Bible. All right, so we could go with Bible Hub, but we'll go with Jewish Virtual Library. Heart. Senses that do not include the heart. Breast, throat, nice. And not strictly senses that do include the heart. All right, so the interior of the body conceived as a seat of inner life, feeling, and thought. Strong feeling is conceived as a stirring or heating of the intestines, as well as the heart. Let's see. Continuing on here, somebody's heart is sick. It means that he's grieving. Heart is obstructed for earlier translations. Blah, 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 blah. One who has no heart is adult, because if a man is wise of heart, it means that he is intelligent or skillful. So this is sort of along the lines of what I'm saying, right? Is that we've got strong emotion in sort of the intestines, and then we've got the heart here having to do with intelligence. Which is, I think that you could certainly, I would encourage you to look more into this, but this is kind of along the lines of what I was saying. On the other hand, in the interest of both aesthetics and usefulness, heart should be substituted in English for emotional kidneys and intestines of the biblical Hebrew, the King James. My bowels were moved for him. So that's probably not a great modern translation, and I can see why they did change it. They were going for a concept, but the point is that words are very weird. And because of that, you have to be very careful when you're making translations. And because Genesis is notorious for mixing poetic and prose elements, and also using words like bara or yom, which can indeed be up for interpretation, it's just not wise to go out there and say, oh, it's clear as day because the English version says this. That's very not a good way of doing it. It's not a proper exegesis, because you're going into it with your preconceived notion that the version you read as a child is the right one. This is why very few people have actually dug into this, and I'm not going to go out there and claim that I'm, the person that you should go to for these kinds of questions. There are way more qualified folks out there. I'm just saying it merits a look.
Think about it. For life to begin on Earth, this cycle had to be started first. We can see from these verses that days and years are linked, with their duration being determined by the fixed movements of Earth in reference to the sun. The Earth, Sun, and Moon are all perfectly synchronized to give us a 24-hour day. This is why the Jewish people count a day from nightfall to nightfall. It all has roots back to the first chapter of Genesis. Notice in the same context where Genesis 1 mentions the days of creation, that days is defined and is even contrasted with years. Surely there's no way to insert millions of years into this text.
Well, the reason why, at least I've heard others have sort of asserted the day-age theory, which, I don't necessarily think is the best interpretation. I tend to subscribe more to the idea that it was intentionally allegorical, and indeed polemic, and had to do with the Babylonian captivity, because they're basically like, Yahweh did all this creating, and it wasn't your God, Babylonians. You guys are wrong. So, but that being said, Yom indeed can mean a period of time, and there are some individuals, Yom, of course, is the Hebrew word for day, and there are individuals who have argued that Yom does mean a period of time, in sort of the biblical Genesis. So no one is no one is trying to make it be the word year. I don't know why we're getting a lesson right here on like, look at a day as a rotation, and look how perfect that is. The sort of baby's first fine-tuning argument, right? Oh, look at the moon, that's a perfect 24 hours. Well, the only reason you think 24 hours is perfect is because that's what you're used to. Obviously, days used to be shorter in the past because rotation used to be different, in both within sort of the Earth on its axis, and then indeed, I believe, as the Earth rotates around the sun. Additionally, tidal forces used to be different because the moon used to be closer. It's been receding at varying rates, which I'm sure we're going to touch on at some point, because creationists have this real hankering for it's either a constant rate or it's not. There's no, or like rather, it's either this rate or it's this rate. They don't like changing rates because they don't get to use them for radiometric dating or like the speed of light, which are completely different from and sort of isolated equations when compared to equations like lunar recession, which can be influenced by, say, how the continents have fit together. That influences the gravitational relationship between the moon and the Earth. But they don't like that. That's a big no-no. They poo-poo on varying rates because they don't get to do it when they want to. But let's continue. I'm sure we're going to get a fascinating lesson, maybe on months, since we've already covered days and years.
You can also tell that the word Yom in Genesis 1 means an actual day, because each usage of the word day is prefaced by evening, morning, and then a number. Yom.
I think that's against their case, if anything, because that's one of the poetic elements of Genesis is the fact that there are all these reprisals and repeats. That tends to be what's typical of a poem, and not so much of a prose when we're looking at the Bible. Day is used 2,301 times in the Old Testament. Why only question Genesis? Because Genesis is the only one that lends itself to a mix between poetry and prose and sort of kind of presents itself in a hyperbolic fashion, even in the original Hebrew, which, I encourage people to check with their favorite academic on the subject. And no, Kent Hovind and Ken Ham don't count as academics. Sorry.
Is used 2,301 times in the Old Testament. When used with a number, Yom always means an ordinary day, and this occurs 410 times outside of Genesis 1. Evening and morning are used together without Yom 38 times, and it always means an ordinary day. Evening or morning is used together with Yom 23 times each, and it always means an ordinary day. Night is used with Yom 52 times, always meaning an ordinary day.
I think let's dissect that. I think this is a good opportunity to kind of look into this a bit. I really wish they didn't have this bad animation right here. I really wish we could just see them all without the sunlight, the glaring sun beaming. Okay, dang it. This is Dan Biddle's doing. All right, we'll just let him go again, and then we'll pause at each one that we want, if I can make it happen. Does that sound good to you guys? You can't answer, so captive audience. Okay, cool. So, day with number, 410 times, always means an ordinary day. Now, immediately your alarm bell should be going off because we're not actually shown any examples of this, which means I could theoretically be like, hey, like with the previous example of 6 and 1, I could be like, well, look at this verse in Exodus. It always varies. Throughout every book of the Bible, we see variations. And you're not probably going to be the type to go in and check my sort of facts on that. So let's do a quick search. All right. Usage of the word Yom in the Bible. Okay. Creation Today might be a little bit of a biased source. Old Earth Ministries, also probably going to be biased, but let's see what they have to say anyways. because we're looking for a refutation, so it's kind of okay to I mean, this isn't typically good scholarly practice to like look for something that backs your point, but since I don't have, it's one of those things where since I've sort of heard examples before, but I don't know them off the top of my head, this is what's likely going to go ahead and give me the results that I'm at least trying to reference. Alright, so the Hebrew word for day is the word yom. Young Earth creationists have always argued that the word used for day can only mean a 24-hour day. In this article, we examine uses of yom in the Old Testament and show that it can mean a wide variety of time periods. For one, we must understand that the Hebrew language is not nearly as diverse as our human language. Wow, that almost sounds like something I said earlier. Whereas our vocabulary is around 500,000, the Hebrew language only has 8,700 words. The French language, one of the poorest modern languages in vocabulary and the language of choice for diplomats, has just 40,000 words, or over 4 times the amount of words the ancient Hebrews have. So this is kind of, again, what I was talking about earlier when I was like, there's a lot of wiggle room when we're translating for like words like heart and mind and entrails and things like that, to make it make sense in sort of a modern context. And that's why you have to be so careful. And that's why we leave this up to people who actually know the original Hebrew. All right, so Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible and the Theological World Book of the Old Testament say that Yom typically denotes a period of light contrasted with a period of darkness, a period of 24 hours, a general vague time, a point in time, or a year when in the plural. Whereas Strong says that it can be used to mean hot, a day, figuratively, sort of a whether literal or figuratively, it tends to denote periods of time, outlived, perpetually present, etc., etc. It can be used for blah, 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 various things. Pretend that what I said was just coherent. Other uses of the word yom. Day is not the only translation, so it can mean time, because it's interesting to note that in 67 verses, the word yom is translated into the English word time. For instance, in Genesis 4:3, it says, "And in process of time came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground, and from the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord." In this instance, Yom refers to a growing season, probably several months. Again, in Deuteronomy 10:10, it refers to a time equal to 40 days. In Isaiah 38, it says, "Now go, write it before them in a table and note it in a book, and may it be for the time to come forever and ever." In this case, yom is equal to forever. How long is forever? An infinite number of years, an infinite number of yoms, billions upon billions upon billions upon billions, until the heat death of the universe. So saith the Lord. It can mean a year, it can mean an age, it can mean ago, it can mean always, it can mean season, it can mean chronicles, it can mean continually, it can mean ever, it can mean evermore. And, of course, there is indeed yom in the creation account. Even in the creation account, it's used to represent 4 different time periods, called the light day, which means yom, which is translated as yom, 4 days, yom, in the day, yom, so that's 3 different periods. Capital D, day, is a title, multiple days, and, of course, a single day. Moses uses yom in many other ways. I mean, really, we can go through this. We can beat this dead horse. The question is, why weren't those 67 mentions brought up here? Because 67 is, of course, less than 410, but it's more than 38, it's more than 23, and it's more than 52, which leads me to do one of these eyebrow raise at you, Genesis Apologetics, and at you, Daniel Biddle, because this feels a bit dishonest. I will hopefully remember to link this in the description so that you guys can have a look at it. Again, there are people who don't buy into the whole, like for instance, John Walton, who I reference and probably will reference quite a bit, who's a theistic evolutionist and takes Genesis as a temple account or perhaps an allegory. He thinks that Yom does mean a day, but it doesn't really matter because it's allegorical anyways. So the point is, though, is there are multiple interpretations of Genesis. Many of them have more credence than the Young Earth version, but the Young Earth creationists like to pretend like it's like their version is the only interpretation worth looking at, which is silly and dumb and annoying, right? Ooh, look, we've got a picture of a chimp coming up. I sure hope we say some dumb stuff about evolution. That's my favorite. All right.
A third of the text is dedicated to defining the chronology of the creation process. In Jeremiah 33, God said that he made a promise that earth would always have a day and night cycle, just as permanently as David's throne would have a king. This day and night cycle has been repeated for all recorded history, and it all began in Genesis 1 verse 5 when God called the light day and the darkness he called night. This cyclical succession of light and darkness has always constituted a solar day. The genealogies in the first 11 chapters of Genesis map straight back to Adam, who
Something just occurred to me, and it's probably occurred to you as well. And I'm sorry I didn't mention it earlier because it's also a pretty typical gotcha, at least from sort of my side of the argument here, which is, how is there light if the sun doesn't come until several days later? There's no sun and there's no moon, I believe, or at least there's no sun, moon, and stars until, let's see, oops, I'm going to need this link for later. Days of creation. Okay, good. Look at it. Day 4. We're a little late to the game, aren't we, young Earth creationism? I really like that. Why is Adam tan and Eve is white? That's like your nice little diversity attempt here. But we all know about Genesis apologetics and their diversity. They would love this if this was indeed theirs. Yeah, so I'm not sure why he's spending so much time talking about the day-night cycle with regard to the rotations of the sun, moon, and earth, when we don't even have those yet. Bad egg, Genesis apologetics.
was created on the sixth day of creation. It also describes that Adam was created out of dust, and Eve from his side, and they were created in the image of God, not in the image of some evolved ape-like creatures.
You know what I notice about this lovely, I believe, this is obviously a chimp or a bonobo. I wish I was good at, I believe this is a bonobo because we can see the part here and we can see a sort of pinkishness on the lips. So I believe that this is a bonobo. Daniel Biddle, everyone at Genesis Apologetics, myself and everyone watching, not only are we related to the apes, we are still apes. That's how the law of monophily works, but Dan Biddle wouldn't know that. Now, we could talk about all the similarities that humans have with, of course, the likes of the bonobo, and how strange it is that if God created humans literally in the image of himself, that he would choose to give so many traits to them that are shared with the other apes. That would seem to imply to me that God likes apes very much, and that they too are at least partially made in his physical image. We could look to the fact that we shared 99 almost % of our genomes when we're comparing, base pair coding regions. We could talk about the fact that our morphology is incredibly similar, that we have a perfect gradient, seemingly very perfect gradient of fossil specimens that span from the very chimp-like Sahelanthropus to anatomically modern Homo sapiens. We could talk about the fact that our ears look the same, that we both have flatter faces than the rest of the primates, that we have dexterous hands, and that we have bald faces, and of course in the case of the bonobo, even less hair than of course the two of us share with chimpanzees. We could talk about the social behaviors that link us together. We could show about the compassion, the tolerance, the war, the sexuality. We could talk about a lot of things. But one thing that they won't talk about is just the very basic fact that we look the same. Because that's kind of awkward, is it not? If you're touting that humans are made in the image, physical image of God, and then of course you show a bonobo that. If I were to stand here and make her pose and look to the side, I'm sure we look quite similar, and that's because we're cousins. We're both primates, and we're both catarrhines, and of course we're both hominoids and indeed hominids, depending on how you're defining it. But what was I gonna say? Oh yeah. Bad Genesis apologetics. Shame on you. Go to the principal's office. I'm sure that this lovely bonobo here did not consent to be in your propaganda video, full of misinformation.
These genealogies list 87 patriarchs by name and their sons, and the birth and lifespan years are given for 33 of them. How could this even possibly not be a historical account? How much more straightforward could God have been?
You mean in the English version or the Hebrew version? Because the answer is, in the original text, it's incredibly vague because again we're working with 8,700 words. So I don't think that this is a winning battle on the part of Genesis apologetics. It's not like we have any sort of guarantee that the translation is indeed 100% correct or that the interpretation is 100% correct.
It's really a matter of authority, believing God's word over man's word.
Believing your interpretation of God's word over conventional science.
Yes, there are passages like Psalm 104, Job 38, and Isaiah 40 that provide poetic descriptions of creation. God is riding on the clouds in a chariot, shutting in the seas with immense doors, or measuring the waters with his hands.
So why do you suppose that Genesis apologetics gets to decide what is poetic and what is prose? And moreover, why do you suppose they haven't mentioned the poetic elements in their true nature, at least, with regard to Genesis? It's because that would mean that they are potentially wrong, and they don't like that. Nobody wants to look like a big dingus on YouTube. YouTube's where the mean kids lurk, and they might get made fun of. So
we wouldn't expect these to be read as historical narratives. They are clearly poetic.
I rest my case.
The multiple uses of the word like in the poetic context express creation in dramatic and vivid language.
So what do you think is the poetic context? Would it perhaps be the existence of refrains, repeated phrases, doublets, perhaps? Because all of those exist in Genesis, and I'm sure we'll get the opportunity to discuss many of them together.
However, the genre of the book of Genesis is clearly historical. This is evident for many reasons, but we'll consider just three. First, Genesis provides an unbroken narrative. From creation to the fall, the flood, then on to Abraham, Moses, and David, all leading up to Jesus the Savior.
So something can be chronological and also be hyperbolic. That's generally the consensus with regard to Genesis, actually, because it's a merging of two distinct genres. It's at least in sort of the wordage of some, it's considered exalted prose, which would be it's hyperbole. It's exaggerated, and that's okay. As long as you recognize that it is so, or at least in the case of Genesis apologetics, that there is that possibility. The arrogance of assuming and asserting that your point of view is certainly correct, because reasons. But let's hear the other two.
Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus back to Abraham and Luke back to Adam. Where in this unbroken line would we stop and say we are just working with some poetic imagination? The flood? The fall? Adam's sin? We can't pick and choose the history we like and dislike. Second, Genesis 1 through 11 is written in the genre of Hebrew prose, recorded by the writer to include 87 patriarchs and birth and lifespans given for 33 of them. Some say the creation account is just figurative. Can this be so? Is it just poetry? Not according to Hebrew expert Dr. Stephen Boyd, who ran a statistical analysis of the text. By looking at the different types of verbs that are used in Hebrew poetry compared to historical works, Dr. Boyd determined that there is a 99.5% likelihood that the Genesis creation account is literal history, not poetry.
I think that this is a good thing to investigate. What do you guys think? Is Genesis poetic or prose or both? What do we think? Okay, so texts on Genesis from webcn.edu. I'm not a really big fan of like this this sort of page here. This feels a little bit what's the word I'm looking for? Pre-Y2K. All right, let's see. To understand, scholars are talking about two sections of Genesis, eloquent and eminently quotable. I think they're a fan. Okay, sequences slightly different in the Genesis account. Oh, God, there's so much text here. Is there an in conclusion, do we think? Oh, that maybe will let us know. Well, it does say this. At this point in their Babylonian captivity, the Hebrews incorporated a number of concepts into their later religious practice. Biblical scholars think these late religious practices probably include special treatment of the Sabbath day, elaborate taboos regarding what is kosher, taboos regarding writing down the name of God, etc., etc., and then it talks about the documentary hypothesis. So at the very least, I think it did say something about it being non-poetic over here. So that says Genesis, but this isn't talking about the... Oh, no, yes it is. Okay, non-poetic, written in prose rather than poetic lines, no meter. It doesn't use anaphora and parallelism in the same way as the first section does. So, it's a mix. Isn't that something? To indicate the non-poetic nature of the text here, most NIV translations break the text into 2 paragraphs. So essentially, we're seeing Genesis 1 being poetic, and Genesis 2, 4, and then 3 to 323 is prose rather than poetic. Isn't that kind of what I said, a mix between the two? Christian Courier can check them too. Oh, also, I think I mentioned this, but this is also about like the documentary hypothesis and things like that. It talks about the Babylonian captivity and how a lot of later traditions and things like that were added in postscript almost. This is almost precisely what I accept here. So I will link that as well if I remember, but I very well might not. Okay, so Genesis is history, not poetry. Institute for Creation Research could potentially be a bit biased. Is Genesis 1 a type of Hebrew poem? It's not normal prose either, is what it said right there, but let's see. This is kind of like a Quora thing, but it is Genesis apologetic, or not apologetics, it is sort of kind of, what's the word, like theological in nature. Elevated prose. Not pure poetry. Seems unlikely it was used as a song of praise, as the Psalms were rather in its present form. It is a careful literary composition introducing the succeeding narratives. So, I rest my case. It's very nice that this individual, who does seem to be an expert, if they say his name again, we'll look him up and sort of look into his thought process, because I would like to look at his methodology here. It seems sound, sort of from the outlook. But I would also be interested in seeing from when it comes, like when this was published in sort of a journal, because it's only been somewhat recent that the documentary hypothesis or derivatives of it have been entirely accepted, as well as the Babylonian captivity and this exalted prose idea.
Third, Moses recorded that God wrote with his own hands that he created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. This is what the writer, God, intended to convey, and it's been interpreted like this for generations since it was given.
Wrong. Big wrong. Big, fat, super big wrong. St. Augustine, Origen, for a period of time, not the guy that wrote Paradise Lost, not Milton. Damn, I normally have a book over there, but I've lent it out to someone. It's called The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve. I highly recommend it. He's a French guy. But he also didn't. He was in the 1600s. We actually see a fairly uninterrupted sort of series of people groups, or members of the church who are like, hey, I don't know that we're interpreting creation correctly. Of course, they weren't going around saying, we think that we believe in evolutionary theory and an ancient Earth, because those ideas didn't come around until Hutton, Lyell, and Darwin in the mid-1800s. So I'm not implying that. What I am implying is that an allegorical interpretation was not ruled out ever since the very beginning of the religion. So this is just plain incorrect. And if you really want to look into sort of the idea of when young Earth creationism actually popped up, when did young Earth creationism pop up? The evolution of creationist movements. This is an actual academic paper. I imagine that it's quite excellent, just because it's in Springer, which is nice. Okay, let's see here. Since the mid-20th century, young Earth creationists, starting with Henry Morris, have devised and promoted a pseudoscientific explanation called creation science as a basis for religious belief in a supernatural, geologically recent creation. But we want the history. because I believe it's Adventism. The rise of fundamental Christianity at the start of the 20th century brought the rejection of evolution. Its leaders explained in ancient Earth through belief in the gap or the day-age interpretation of Genesis. In 1923, George McCready Price, a Seventh-day Adventist, wrote The New Geology, inspired by, oh God, look at that, that's terrible. Also prophet Ellen G. White, prophetess, I guess is a better word. We're not talking that young Earth creationism is like a tried and true method. It's relatively new. And up until that point, an allegorical interpretation of Genesis has always been on the table. What are these guys talking about? Nonsense is the answer.
If this is not what was meant by God, when did the writers of Scripture or Jesus fix it, setting the record straight? The great reformer Martin Luther even wrote, when Moses writes that God created heaven and earth and whatever is in them in 6 days, then let this period continue to have been 6 days, and do not venture to devise any comment according to which 6 days were one day. But if you cannot understand how this could have been done in 6 days, then grant the Holy Spirit the honor of being more learned than you are. For you are to deal with Scripture in such a way that you bear in mind that God himself says what is written. But since God is speaking, it is not fitting for you to wantonly turn his word in the direction you wish to go.
Oh, dang it. I really wanted to pause on that. Hold on. This is good enough. Credit where credit is due to Martin Luther. I've heard he's a great guy from my contemporaries, who of course knew him. But note here that it says, then let this period continue to have been 6 days, and do not venture to devise any comment according to which 6 days were one day. So again, this is adding to my sort of prior assertion that this has been an entanglement for quite some time. Young Earth creationism has not been the norm. It has been sort of the 6,000-year-old Bishop Lightfoot interpretation has been out there for quite some time. I think Lightfoot was like the 1600s. I'm not sure. But certainly not the only nor the dominant sort of thought process with regard to how Genesis should be interpreted. So stop lying, Genesis Apologetics, or at least do your research, because I know it's not that difficult. We're doing it as we go, and it's not that hard. Basic Google searches are supporting things that I'm saying, and they're like the first search result. You know, it's not difficult to educate yourself. This is how I look anytime I accidentally turn on my front-facing camera, though. Martin Luther here, in his little tricolor hat. Got the little double chin going on, maybe a little triple right here. That's me.
Deal with Scripture in such a way that you bear in mind that God himself says what is written. But since God is speaking, it is not fitting for you to wantonly turn his word in the direction you wish to go. The Bible has God miraculously creating the world and everything in it in just 6 days about 6,000 years ago. But the theory of evolution has a much different timescale, taking millions of years to go from goo to me and you by way of the zoo.
I'm a really, really, really big, long-time fan of the various monikers that are used. Goo to me and you by way of the zoo. I like that one. I like fish to fisherman. I like molecules to man. They really like the alliteration. They really like the little nursery rhyme things. It doesn't make you any less right any more than it makes Mother Goose's tales correct. And I really don't like that they've I feel like they've probably ripped this from somewhere, but I don't know that for certain. So let's leave that as sort of a Gutsick Gibbon skeptical take. Because they do steal things from everywhere else, quite frequently.
Which view is correct? Well, to be honest, both views require faith because no one was there thousands or millions of years ago to observe.
So wrong. I'm taking a moment here to shamelessly plug Jackson Weed and RJ Downard's The Rocks were there, because coincidentally they were. Let's look it up really fast so that you guys can see it and go out and buy it, because it is an excellent text. The Rocks were there. Right here. Looks like they've already got a mean reviewer. I need to log in and leave them something stellar. It's an excellent book, I guarantee you. That's serious scientists start with God's creation of energy as information. So there you have it. It's an excellent comprehensive book. I would highly recommend it. Buy the paperback. It's always nice to have a paperback book on your shelf. Exit. Yeah. So, no, you don't have to have a physical witness there to write things down. Otherwise, any event that we have in the history of just human civilization that we don't explicitly have in cuneiform or anything later, it might as well not have happened according to these guys, which is absolutely absurd. Evolutionary theory and the age of the Earth require no faith. They merely require an acceptance of basic equations in math and physics for the age of the Earth, and an acceptance of the biological tenets that drive any kind of adaptation or change in organisms today. If you want to cry about information and say that information can't change, first define information for me, because no one's really been able to do it. Most structures that exist are not novel. They're simply adaptations of a structure that existed previously. And that goes all the way back up to that first single-cellular organism in the goo, the RNA world, and onward. Let's continue.
Of how it all got started. But can the idea of millions of years of evolution be scientifically validated? Can
Yes.
we really prove this idea of deep time using the same observational science we use for making medicine and putting people on the moon?
Yes, you can. Because, for instance, in nuclear medicine, which is just interestingly enough what my father does, he's a radiologist, you do rely on the principles of physics in order to devise proper treatments for individuals, as well as to peer into what's going on in their insides with x-rays or PET scans or CAT scans or MRIs, what have you. So nuclear principles are relatively sound, and that's where we get the radioactive decay law from, which is what radiometric dating is. It's simply measuring the ratio of isotopes of one element as they spontaneously decompose into isotopes of another element. It's that simple. So, yes, the answer is yes, you can validate ancient Earth using these same principles.
Validation is the process of confirming what is believed to be true by what can be observed to be true. Has this ever been done for radiometric dating? The
Yes. Yes, it has.
process that gives us the very idea of long ages? Actually, long ages and radiometric dating hasn't stood up to the validation test. Radiometric dating has never been validated against the absolute known ages of rocks. Let us explain.
Okay, no. Before you explain, I can already tell where you're going. So there are some basic principles of radiometric dating that need to be understood. You can't just radiometrically date any old rock, all right? It has to be, I believe it's igneous. It has to be an igneous rock, right? Of a very particular kind that hasn't been found around radioactive materials or elements, and since rocks indeed very rarely move from their spot in quantities that would impact the kind of mass sampling that we do when we radiometrically date a location or an area, I find it very hard to believe indeed that what we're about to be shown is going to fall in line with that. So observe what's happening here. They're taking these four ages, 39 years, 36 years, 34 years, and 500 years of recent volcanic eruptions, and they're trying to radiometrically date them. So the positive news is that at least we're using igneous rock. The bad news is you cannot radiometrically date, and this includes carbon dating, by the way. Anything that is younger than, I believe, it's at least like 1,000 years. If you radiometrically date things that have happened too recently, you get wildly bizarre readings because you have nothing that has decayed into the daughter isotopes yet. It screws with everything. This is particularly true if you're looking at very, very slowly decaying elemental relationships like rubidium strontium. Given the half-life is like, what's the half-life? Half-life of rubidium. Yeah, so it's 48.8 billion years. You're going to have a problem if you're dating something impeccably young using. This is why rubidium strontium is only used for very old rock. Why can't let me double check this for you guys. We carbon date recently dead things. Why is carbon-14 used to date fossils? I don't think this is what we're looking for here. I normally have a book when I'm living in the States that's titled The Bible, Rocks, and Time. It's excellent for this exact thing. It has a nice little chart in it that covers all of the ideal dates. Okay, carbon dating for trees, plants, animal remains. But remember that when you're dating fossils, really what you are dating is the rock around the fossils, because the fossil itself is rock that has, or it's mineralized bone, essentially. Applying carbon-14 dating to recent human remains. Let's try range where carbon dating is effective. Boop. Okay. Radiocarbon dating. Alright, the period of time after half a sample has decayed is about 5,730 is the earliest, I believe they're going to say. Let's see. History, physical concepts, chemical details, principles, carbon exchange reservoir. I'm not a geologist. I really wish I was. See, you notice I don't have to preface this when I'm talking about primates, because by the end of the year, technically, I'm kind of a primatologist, which is going to be quite cool. All right, let's see. What was it? It was 5,700? Yeah, okay. So the half-life, plus or minus 47, very close to the modern reservoir. I believe that this is fair enough. But let's see if we can't get one more result over here, shall we? Thanks to fossil fuels, carbon dating is in jeopardy. Oh, good. How accurate is carbon dating? LabMate. What do you guys think? Is this going to be, to the uninitiated, surefire way to predict the age of the Earth, of any organism that once lived on the planet? Well, not any organism. As we previously said, mineralization can bust that up a little bit. Okay, the half-life is, 5,730 years. So, another for the, okay. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, carbon dating is not the most reliable means of radiometric dating, but I would like to point out that radiometric dating is, at least in part, it plays a role in the oil and gas that we find, that we seek out. Errors are feared in carbon dating. 31st of May, 1990. I'll look into this and get back to you, but my point is here, right? Certainly with radiometric dating, also with carbon dating, you cannot date things too early, and you cannot use incorrect elements to date certain rocks, right? So now you might be asking, okay, well, if that is the case, how do you figure out what kind of dating you should use for what kind of rocks? And that's a great question. Part of understanding why we use certain methods to date certain rocks has to do with cross-checking sort of other methods. If rocks in the same layers get the same dates with the same methods, it's probably fairly decent to assume that is the correct means. But also the law of superposition, which states that obviously the lower you go down, the older certain things are. So there is indeed an incredible amount of thought that goes into whenever we radiometrically date something in particular. But it is impeccably accurate, and I'm sure we're going to see precisely what I said, but we'll look into each one if it would make you guys feel better.
Consider Mount St. Helens.
Oh my god. Oh guys, Mount St. Helens. This is the go-to. This is the creationist go-to. Oh, I'm getting heartburn. Alright, let's do it.
Erupted in the 1980s, giving scientists the opportunity to date the rocks that were formed from the eruption. The results? 5 different ages, all between 350,000 and 2.8 million years old, for rocks that we know were less than 30 years old. This discrepancy happens all the time in radiometric dating studies.
They actually don't. They're actually incredibly uncommon in radiometric dating studies. Accuracy, radiometric dating. I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing this for you. Oh god, look, this is how I feel, though, typing it. All of a sudden, caps. Radiometric dating. Accuracy of radiometric dating. The basic equation of radiometric dating requires that neither the parent nuclide nor the daughter product can enter or leave the material after its formation. This is something that if you actually use the proper technique, you can kind of suss out. Accurate radiometric dating generally requires that the parent has had a long enough half-life that it will be present in significant amounts at the time of measurement, except as described below under dating with short-lived extinct radionuclides. So this is exactly what we're dealing with right here, you guys. One Google search. Very, very easy. It actually blows my mind. You can't date rocks that are under 30 years of age without taking these kinds of precautions and dating with the proper methods. All right? You can't use potassium argon, half-life of potassium. So the half-life of potassium, what do we got here? Also super old, by the way. So you cannot go around just dating things willy-nilly. Also, Mount St. Helens eruption. Yes, it was in 1980. So we've come quite some way since then. But let's, for grins, dating the rocks at Mount St. Helens. Let's just see what we get. Skeptoid, we don't like that. We really don't want to look at answers in Genesis for this. 30 years later, the lessons from Mount St. Helens, Institute for Creation Research. No, thank you. We want... Oh, look at this. No answers in Genesis. You guys understand, I'm doing this understanding that this is additionally going to have a bias, but the difference is when you go with conventional science, the bias tends to be explained by sound science and links its sources. Look at this. Steve Austin failed to use the potassium argon dating method properly. So let's see if Steve Austin was our culprit here. No, instead, it's other young Earth creationist, Andrew A. Snelling. Why do you suppose that it's the young Earth creationists that are the only ones getting these incorrect dates? What do you guys think that is? Anyways, I'll link this as well in the description because I think you guys deserve it. I have actually read this before, now that I think of it. But it goes through sort of the actual reasons, and look at all these excellent references in APA format, I believe. I think that's APA. I'm not sure. So, what do you guys think so far? Let's continue. Do we think that the other three examples are also going to be poor creationist dating methods?
In fact, there has never been a radiometric dating analysis that simply produces ages that validate to the known ages of rocks.
That's because the known ages of rocks have to be within sort of modern science's observed eye. And none of the half-lives have decayed to the point where you can accurately sample them by the very principle of this kind of decay method. It's not possible. It's not that it's incorrect. It's that you can't do it. And when you do, you get erroneous results. Imagine that.
And if radiometric dating doesn't work for rocks of known ages, why do we trust it for rocks of unknown ages? So the next time you...
Because we base those dates off of an equation that is sound in physics. Nuclear physics. That's the reason. The same nuclear physics that allows us to perform scans on patients that have diseases and pathogens and things like that in radiology.
Here, millions of years ago, this happened or that. Just ask, how do you know that for sure? And if radiometric dating is the answer given, just ask, Are you aware of a study where the radiometric age of a rock agreed with the known age of the rock? And you'll find the answer will undoubtedly be no. God wrote with his own hand that he created the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them in just 6 ordinary days. The genealogies in Genesis lead us straight back to Adam, just about 6,000 years ago. Millions of years can't be jammed into this timeline for the very important reason that Adam and Eve were responsible for bringing the curse of sin, death, disease, suffering, thorns, and thistles into the world. In the evolutionary...
Sin, death, suffering, thorns and thistles. The 5 scourges of modern humanity.
Timescale has these things existing supposedly millions of years before humans were even around. And if these things existed before the consequences of our sin brought them, this makes them God's ideas, rather than the results of our falling away from God. This doesn't fit the Bible because God said his creation was very good, and all life started out vegetarian before the fall. See the problem? Death, suffering, and carnivorism are the result of the fall of Adam and Eve.
Carnivory. Carnivory, not carnivorism.
And we're not part of God's original creation. Have you ever noticed how hard the world pushes the idea of millions of years? Books, movies, museums, schools. It's everywhere. Honestly, it takes faith to believe in either the creation account or in millions of years of evolution. None of us were present when God created and filled the earth. The creation process, through either perspective, goes back further than written history will take us.
That is about the only thing accurate that has been said in this entire presentation. Of course, no one was there. No human was there at 4.8 billion years ago. That is true. But the rocks were there, weren't they?
But when you look at the Earth, the Sun, and the planets spinning through space with an incredible degree of precision so that we have days, seasons, years, warm, cold, seed, and harvest, doesn't it look like the book of Genesis got it right?
No.
That it was all designed and placed here at the beginning?
No.
With this incredibly well-tuned universe working in harmony? Genesis 1 shows that God was setting up the Earth, the cycles, and systems just like a master planner. It all had to be calibrated from the beginning to start and sustain the life on Earth we see today. Days, nights, the monthly cycle of the moon, and the Earth traveling around the sun every year. It all works like clockwork engineered by a master designer.
It feels like that because that's our normal. You can't say that everything is working as it should be because this world was, according to evolutionary theory, according to conventional science, this world wasn't adapted for us. We evolved to fit it. That's why it feels like it's designed. And unlike intelligent design proponents, at least in the sense that they are that God is sort of a consistent tinkerer, we find numerous failings of organisms to adapt to their given surroundings. The Earth didn't feel fine-tuned to the synapsids that perished during the Permian because there was suddenly so much CO2 they were choking. It didn't feel very fine-tuned to the anoxic conditions that were an absolute death march for Camaraceras and Isotylus rex and the Eurypterids that lived in the Ordovician. It didn't feel very fine-tuned to the organisms that were wiped out in the Ediacaran or the Triassic or the Devonian. The problem with this whole idea is that it completely just ignores most conventional science. It addresses some of them, the ones that it thinks it might be able to handle. But otherwise, it just looks the other way.
If you move the distances or change the cycles, the whole thing unravels and we all freeze or fry. Such a finely tuned universe all had to be created and timed in perfect synchronicity. Many Christians believe that creation was a miracle, just like Jesus' resurrection, walking on water, and multiplying 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed thousands. So, is it too difficult to believe that creation was a result of God's command, as the Bible says, and was outside of the natural laws as we know them today? The Bible says that God cannot lie or change his mind, and that his words are permanent and pure, like silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. And it is this very word that tells us that the world was framed by the word of God, and that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. That's because God commanded and they were created, and he commanded and it stood fast. Each of us has a choice about how to frame our worldview. Using man's word or God's word, and how we live our lives stems from what we believe. Because none of us were eyewitnesses, wouldn't it make more sense to go through this life taking God at His word? Looking for answers about what the Bible teaches about creation, the fossil record, dinosaurs?
It's shilling time. Hold on. We gotta get... I'm doing a new thing for every time Genesis Apologetics shills. Hold that thought. It's shilling time.
Download the Genesis Apologetics app from the iTunes or Google Play stores for answers to these questions and more.
Wasn't very on key there, but that should be how it feels.
Myth number 3 is Genesis 1 and 2 provide two different accounts of creation.
And that is where we will leave things for this episode. I really feel like we covered everything in deep enough succession while we were going through it. But the bottom line is, what we're dealing with here is an impeccable ability to ignore. Ignore opposing interpretations of the biblical text. Ignore any and all opposing scientific evidence from the conventional scientific community. And of course, ignore their own sort of religious brothers and sisters begging them to come over to the side of sort of a better means of looking at this. I only had two things. I kind of fell on the end of that one, but I think my point stands. I'm trying to finish strong here, but I'm very tired and I really just want some more tea. And a lot of this just comes down to the fact that the Genesis Apologetics isn't trying to find the truth. They're trying to indoctrinate the youth. That is kind of what it comes down to. They don't listen to scholars of biblical academia. They don't listen to scholars of conventional science. And that's kind of all there is to it. So I think that for this next one, I might try to get a little bit of... I'm not 100% well-versed on this sort of issue, but I am going to look into it a bit before we begin the next episode. And myth 3... We're not even halfway done. The fun is just beginning. So I can't wait to see you here next time. I do hope you come. I realize that these are long episodes, but you help the YouTube algorithm bring people over to listen to my high-pitched and nasally voice, tell them about science and cool things like that. So thank you for being here. And I really do hope that you've enjoyed yourself as much as I have. Or more. Have an excellent day, my fellow modern and gentle apes.